And that's what happens when you take a blowtorch to something that has a rag underneath it soaked in fucking brake cleaner. Welcome back, guys. This is part 5 of the Piaggio Typhoon 70cc full engine build. And today we're going to be using some dry ice to help us with the engine build. Here you can see that the dry ice is minus 45 degrees Celsius, and this bearing that's been in the freezer for like 3 or 4 days is barely hitting minus degrees. So dry ice is a lot colder. And dry ice is useful in this kind of process because it will shrink metal a lot more than a freezer can. So we're going to be moving the bearings and the crankshaft from the freezer to the dry ice. It's important to know that you should handle dry ice carefully, use gloves because it's that cold that it can give you frostbite pretty quickly. And dry ice doesn't melt, it turns into a gas, and that gas is dangerous if you're breathing it in. So whilst the bearings and the crankshaft are on the dry ice, we're going to clean up the casing and get it ready for the installation. After cleaning up both case halves, I was now just going to heat up the casing and hopefully the bearings will push straight in, which is what Mop Boys on YouTube does. However, unfortunately for me, that didn't end up working. Now my theory is that maybe the casing was too hot and it was heating up the bearings too quickly as the bearings touched the casing, and that's why they wouldn't go all the way in. So if I did this again, I'd probably not heat up the casing as much. So I ended up just using a socket around the outer edge of the bearings and hammering them in carefully to make sure that no damage was done on the installation. So now it's time to get the cases ready to be sealed back together with the crankshaft. So we're just going to rub some Honda Bond all around the case halves where the cases meet, and hopefully we don't get any air leaks. I then heated up the inside of the bearings just a little bit with a heat gun, definitely no blowtorch this time, and it's time to install the crankshaft. As you can see, the part that I feared the most went really well. The crankshaft went straight in nice and easy. Now we just push this case half into the other case half with the crankshaft installed. Once I'd done all this, I was a bit skeptical about how free the crankshaft was spinning because I didn't understand at the time that you need to center the crankshaft, which means that it probably needed pulling more towards the variator side. But we're going to circle back to that towards the end of the video because there's still a lot more things I need to show you first. So by now I've already installed the piston and I must have forgot to get that bit on camera, but the important thing to remember when you're doing this is that there's an arrow on top of the piston and that arrow needs to face the exhaust port. One other thing to remember when you're putting these piston rings on is that on the piston itself there's a little pin in each groove and the piston rings just sit around that pin. When installing any sort of cylinder kit, it's important to make sure you get some lubricant, so take some 2-stroke oil and just rub it around the inside of the cylinder before you slide that cylinder down onto the piston. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky and fiddly, but when you're sliding that cylinder down onto the piston, you need to squeeze the piston rings together, but make sure that the piston rings stay seated where they're supposed to be around those 2 individual pins in each groove. Now what we're going to do here is called checking the squish. So I've taken a piece of solder that's about 0.9mm thick, and now we're just going to tape that solder to the piston. And it's important to remember that when you're doing this, the solder needs to go to the very edges of the piston. And then what we're going to do is squish that solder down with the cylinder head and then take readings of how much the solder was squished with a micrometer or a micrometer, however you say it. And it will tell us basically if the base gasket needs to be thicker or thinner. And this is all to make sure that you don't have too much compression between the piston and the cylinder head, otherwise you could damage the engine. Other important steps that I didn't mention was that when you're doing this, the piston needs to be at top dead center. The piston needs to be as high up in the cylinder as it can go before you start tightening down the cylinder head. Now you remove the cylinder head, remove the solder, and you're checking now with the micrometer to see how much the solder has been squished. One thing I would recommend is don't use plastic micrometers because they're just a bit flexible and you don't get as accurate readings, so I wouldn't use these ones again. But what you're looking for is for that micrometer to read 0.7, and you need to make sure that you're measuring the area of the solder that's been squished. Don't measure the center of the solder, it needs to be the edges where you've squished it down. 0.7 is a very safe area to be in. Anything less than that and you probably need a thicker base gasket. And yeah, that means that you're probably going to have to do this step a few times over unless you're lucky and you get the squish perfect the first time around. Once you're happy with those readings, it's time to move on to actually sealing up the cylinder kit and finalizing your build. So I'm just running some Honda Bond on the base gasket, which again will also actually open up that squish tolerance a little bit, so it will go from say a 0.7 to maybe a 0.8 once you put a bit of Honda Bond on everything. And I also put a little bit of Honda Bond on the head for 2 reasons. 1, because I want to make sure it definitely seals, and 2, because every time I try to put the cylinder head against the cylinder kit, That little O-ring that you just saw kept falling out and it was a nightmare. A little bit of Honda Bond will hold that ring in place and you won't have to worry about it falling out as you're putting the cylinder head down on the cylinder. Now we can get some Honda Bond around the area where the reed valves and the intake manifold are going to go. Now I'm going to install the reed valves, and there is a gasket there which you can't see. It's on the reed valve itself, and I've Honda Bonded that to the reed valves as well, just to make sure everything seals. And before I put the intake manifold on, I also ran some Honda Bond between the intake manifold and the reed valves as well. Now the final step is installing the crank seals, which are those orange rings you can see right there. And I was advised that we should put some thread lock around the outside of the crank seals to make sure that they are basically held in tight against the casing, and that two-stroke oil that I just shown is going to go on the inside of the seals before we slide them down onto the crankshaft. I also purchased this crank seal installation tool which helps us slide the seals into place without damaging anything. And I was told to use this tool by hand only, not to use the hammer on it, but I did give it just a few light taps with a rubber mallet just to make sure they were properly seated. Now we do the same process for the opposite side, so a bit of thread lock on the outside of the seal and a little bit of oil on the inside. So now it's been 24 hours and everything has had time to seal and dry, and we can do a pressure test or a leak down test to make sure there's no air leaks on the engine. So we pump this gauge up to 6 psi, wait 10 to 20 minutes, and if the needle moves down below 6 psi, then we know we've got an air leak. So I've sped the video up so that we can see if it leaks, and it does go down quite slowly, so there is an air leak somewhere. And I found that one of the air leaks was actually on the gauge itself, so I silicone sealed this, and then we waited and we checked again once this had dried. As per usual, it's the inlet manifold, or more specifically, the stage 6 reed valves are leaking between the casing, so we ended up resealing this, waiting 24 hours and checking it again. Now guys, I did say to you that we were going to circle back to the whole centering the crank thing. This is a crank puller that we've got on the variator side of the crankshaft, and I'm trying to pull the crankshaft further over to the variator side of the casing. And if you haven't guessed, this took place after I'd already put the engine fully together, so that means that what you're seeing right now is me having stripped the engine back apart, and I'm basically starting all over again. The idea is, if the crankshaft isn't spinning freely, then the crankshaft isn't centered between the two bearings. So after spending over an hour trying to get the crankshaft to pull more towards the variator side, I figured that maybe there was a bearing issue and the bearing wasn't seated properly, and I ended up taking all the bolts back out of the flywheel side of the casing and pushing the crankshaft back out of the variator side and trying to make sure that bearing was definitely fully seated. I didn't get all of this on video, but I did get a few little clips here and there. It has taught me quite a lot though, and I'm probably going to use the crank puller in future a little bit earlier on in the build. I might not even use dry ice next time. But yeah, long story short, I'm happy with how the engine is now, and there's definitely a lot more content that I need to edit and get out for you guys for the following week. But it's been a very busy build, and it's been a lot of hard work. I'm not going to lie to you guys, it wasn't the easiest thing to do because of the few issues I had. But this has definitely taught me a lot, and I know that if I do any more future builds, perhaps on the Yamaha, I'm going to know what I'm doing, and it's going to go a lot smoother, a lot quicker. So guys, that's all for this video. Keep an eye out for what's coming next. And don't forget to like, follow, and share this with your friends. Hit that repost button because it helps me out a lot. Alright, thanks a lot guys. See you later.